Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Tom.
Hey, it's day 2 of our history unit, and it's really kind of a fascinating subject. It can be a little scary, I think, but it can also be very enlightening, very entertaining. And we're talking about spiritualism. And you might think we're talking about religion when we say that word, but we're really not. Spiritualism is kind of a practice that people started participating in the mid-1800s, where they would actually try to communicate with the dead. They were called mediums, and they had some special gift, supposedly, that could allow them to talk to maybe a dad or a mom or an uncle, a grandpa that had passed away. And maybe some of these family members just wanted to tie up, some sort of argument they had. Sometimes people pass away quite suddenly, and we don't get to say those last words. I remember when my mom passed away, I wanted so badly, because it happened quickly, so badly just to say one more time that I loved her. And that was really something that bothered me for so long. So I can see why people would be very interested in working with someone who supposedly had a gift to talk to the dead. But unfortunately, Tom, a lot of these people who said they had the gift were just frauds. They had no gift at all, and they were just ripping people off because, of course, you'd have to pay a lot of money to have one of these mediums speak to your dead relatives.
Right, so yeah, they were frauds, and of course, they were found out later on, but I think this practice still exists, and there are people out there who believe it is possible to actually speak to the dead. Personally, I loved my grandparents and stuff like that, and my uncles who are gone now, and, it'd be kind of nice to talk to them again, but, the kind of communication I want to have, say, with my grandfather would be several days, I'd like to actually talk to him about life back then when he was alive, but I realize that just can't happen, so I don't think I have any unfinished business with any of them either, so I don't think I need these services, but some people might need these services and feel there is some unfinished business that they need to communicate with their dead relatives about. So I guess we'll continue talking about spiritualism and mediums in today's lesson, and also talk about the Fox sisters. So let's get to it. Let's read through the entire contents of our lesson now one time. From the time the Fox sisters came on the scene, the spiritualist movement attracted nearly as many skeptics as it did supporters. Many seances were attended by journalists or scientists endeavoring to debunk the deceptive practices of mediums, and many times they succeeded. One of the most vocal opponents of spiritualism was famed stage magician Harry Houdini. Houdini began his campaign against spiritualism after a seance where a medium offended him by invoking his deceased mother's spirit in an obviously false way. Using the skills he'd perfected for stage magic, Houdini dedicated much of his time to blowing the whistle on fraudulent mediums, a tradition that other stage magicians still follow to this day. The reason so many scientists sought to expose mediums as frauds wasn't just out of an impulse to be right. Mediums were often accused of preying on vulnerable people and using their grief to make a profit. Even spiritualists themselves admitted to this, including the Fox sisters. After performing seances for 40 years, the two women responsible for starting the spiritualist craze denounced the movement, disclosing that they'd faked everything. As the 20th century rolled on, spiritualism's status diminished, and it no longer enjoyed the popularity it once had. That's not to say the movement is extinct, though. Spiritualist churches and groups still number in the hundreds and can be found around the world. In the UK, spiritualism is counted as the 8th largest religious group. However, despite maintaining its main principle of communication with the afterlife, modern spiritualism has mostly done away with the illusions and showmanship of earlier practitioners. Most mediums are now simply mental mediums who speak for the deceased without physical displays. With many people still practicing modern spiritualism, it seems that there is still interest in searching for answers from the spirit world.
We're going to get started now, guys. Day 2 of Speaking for the Dead, the Rise and Fall of Spiritualism. This is a common way to title something from history. The rise and fall of something. The rise and fall of the Greek Empire. You could use it for a lot of different things. In history, of course, there's always something that becomes very popular. And then that sort of movement has problems, or maybe a war breaks out, and you see that it kind of diminishes or falls. We're talking about spiritualism. It was very popular when it first started, I think. And although it's still kind of around today, it's not quite as popular. Although it's popular enough, we're going to find out that people still actually follow this sort of spiritualism. So from the time the Fox sisters came on the scene, to come on the scene just means they're noted or they're observed by the public for the first time. The spiritualist movement, we're calling it a movement. That's what we call a lot of new trends that happen. It attracted nearly as many skeptics as it did supporters. If you're a skeptic, you're someone who doesn't really believe very easily. Yeah, show me some proof. Or you could be skeptical, which just means that's the adjective form. But a skeptic isn't easily persuaded to believe in something without actual proof.
Exactly. So most people believe that vaccines are good for us, but there are skeptics out there who think, no, vaccines are terrible, we need to get rid of them, etc., etc.
I used to believe, but I've seen too much proof lately. Now I wonder. Yeah.
Uh-oh, you're an anti-vaxxer now, huh?
I am kind of right now, sure.
But that's another subject for another day. But basically, again, a skeptic is somebody who doubts something, especially if it's mainstream knowledge and that most people believe it. So these people come out and say, hey, prove it to us. We're not going to believe it until you give us actual proof. So yes, they had a lot of skeptics as well as supporters. And many seances were attended by journalists or scientists endeavoring to debunk the deceptive practices of mediums, and many times they succeeded. So when these mediums come out and they try to get people to follow them, well, they eventually become popular, and then we get journalists or reporters who hear about this, and they want to know what's going on. So they attend these seances to see if they're real or not. And then we also have scientists who come out and check them out as well. They're endeavoring to debunk these deceptive practices. So here we've got the verb to endeavor, which means you basically try to do something with a lot of effort. So yes, indeed, they're trying to debunk these practices. To debunk just means to prove something is false, especially if it's something that a lot of people believe.
A common way to end a letter or to say goodbye to someone who is moving, perhaps, and you won't see them again, is to say, oh, good luck with your future endeavors. Whatever you try to do in the future, we hope you're successful. You'll often hear that, and this is the verb where it comes from. To endeavor just means to try hard to succeed at something. So good luck in your future endeavors or with your future endeavors. And like Tom said, to debunk something is to prove that it's wrong. If something's deceptive, it just means it's trying to deceive you or fool you into believing something's true when it's not. So you can have deceptive practices if perhaps you're selling a brand new type of drug or vitamin and you tell everybody, oh, it's a miracle worker. You're gonna, it'll cure your cancer if you take these pills for a week. But they're really not helpful at all. Those are deceptive practices. Deceptive advertising is still allowed, online. You can see a lot of these sorts of ads. So these practices of mediums, the people who said they could speak to the dead for someone, they were often considered deceptive. They were frauds. They tried to deceive people, fool people into believing that they were really talking to dead relatives. Many times they succeeded, and boy, a lot of those mediums got rich off this.
They did, and I should mention, or we should mention, that something similar to mediums are psychics. Okay, those are people who maybe can read other people's minds or they know something is happening. So it's probably very similar. A lot of people claim that they're psychic and that they have a special ability. And then, of course, we have journalists or scientists who come out and try to debunk them and to prove they're wrong. A famous a person who does that is James Randi, who debunks these psychics all the time. But that's more in modern times. We are focusing specifically on mediums who claim that they can communicate with the dead. So one of the most vocal opponents of spiritualism, or one of the most outspoken skeptics of spiritualism, was Harry Houdini. He was a famed stage magician. Maybe you've heard about him. He had all these different kinds of magic tricks that he performed, and people really believed that he was magical.
Yeah, one of them is pretty famous. It's how he actually died, is he would chain himself up in this big glass container filled with water, and he had to get himself out of the chains before he ran out of air, because he would hold his breath. He actually ended up dying trying that particular trick. Houdini began his campaign against spiritualism after a seance where a medium offended him by invoking his deceased mother's spirit in an obviously false way. Yeah, I can see why he would do that. A campaign against something doesn't mean they're running for office, like running to be president or prime minister. It just means there are a lot of focused actions for something or against something. So he was trying to debunk spiritualism after he had a bad experience in a seance. And this medium, tried to pretend that he was speaking with his dead mother. And Houdini was very offended. It bothered him quite a bit, so that he really tried to go after this and tried to debunk spiritualism as much as he could. This is probably a good time to take a break, guys. So we're going to listen to our Chinese teacher for a bit, and then we'll be back.
Hi everyone, my name is Jenny. 今天我们要继续看第12单元。这一篇文章的主题呢 ，Spiritualism。我们这边就要提到了。这个招魂运动很多支持者，那很多人是怀疑论者 skeptics。 那这句的句构也比较特别，因为他说 spiritualist 这些通灵的人，他们吸引到 skeptics， 也吸引到 supporters。 那结构上我们看到这里有 as a dead supporters， 为什么会出现一个 did 呢？我们要晓得这个 did 当然这是一个助动词，它所取代的也就是前面这个动词 attracted。 换句话说 as it attracted supporters， 换言之它吸引到 skeptics 这些的人数就和它吸引到 supporters 支持论者的人是一样的多的。当然结构上稍微注意一下，再往下，下面就说了，有些人呢，像怀疑论者，他们可是努力拼命的要揭穿灵媒诈欺的行为。这里有个动词 endeavor， 我们知道 endeavor 当动词就是努力，那这边加了 ing 就是变成它的分词形式，它所指的也就是说科学家啦、记者们，他们努力要揭穿灵媒诈欺行为，也就是 who endeavored to。 当然这个 who endeavored to 我们可以把它简化成为一个分词片语，所以动词的 endeavor 加了 ing 变成了分词的形式。好，我们继续往下面看，下面就说到了这些想揭穿的人，有一个很有名的魔术师，可能你也知道这个人就是 Houdini。Houdini 呢，他呢曾经去参加一场降神会，然后在这个降神会里面呢，当场那位灵媒呢，他用错误的方式，然后召唤 Houdini 的母亲的灵魂，然后在那一次的事件里面激怒了 Houdini， 所以说他就开始反对招魂术的活动。我们知道这个来由之后，注意一下文法，这个地方招魂会Seance 后面有一个 where， 当然我们知道 where 这个叫做关系副词，意思就是 in which 也就是在那个招魂会里面，当时有一个灵媒激怒了他。好，我们注意到 where 等于 in which。
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. Let's continue talking about speaking for the dead, the rise and fall of spiritualism. Now, we talked about the fact that mediums were becoming more and more popular during the 1800s. And of course, because they were so popular, a lot of journalists and scientists came out and thought, we're going to see what they're doing. We want to make sure that what they're doing is real or not. So they tried to debunk those deceptive practices. And then, of course, we got the famous magician Harry Houdini. And he really thought that they were full of it. And he wanted to prove that they were just a bunch of frauds, basically. So he attended a seance once, and the medium there offended him by saying, hey, we can talk to your deceased mother. And, of course, Houdini thought, that can't be her. You're just making this up. And I'm very offended that you would say that you communicated with my dead mother. So using the skills he'd perfected for stage magic, Houdini dedicated much of his time to blowing the whistle on fraudulent mediums, a tradition that other stage magicians still follow to this day. So he was a stage magician. He knew all about deceiving people or performing magic to get them to believe that something was happening when it really wasn't. So he knew all about this. So he thought that he could use his magic skills as a way to expose these mediums as frauds. So I think he was actually quite successful with that. He dedicated much of his time to blowing the whistle. You're foul. You've just fouled there. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So that's what blowing the whistle means. You're basically calling somebody out and saying, hey, you've committed a foul. You are a bad person.
In the government, we have people called whistleblowers who go and testify that there are people that are corrupt in the government. And supposedly they're protected by the police or the FBI, whoever is, trying to cut down on crime. Those are whistleblowers. You still hear about them today. So yeah, he wanted to expose or show these mediums as frauds or, tricksters as they were. And it wasn't just out of an impulse to be right. If you have an impulse to do something, guys, it just means you have a really strong urge to do something, a desire to act. Some people are described as being impulsive. Maybe when you're not feeling so happy, you impulsively buy things you shouldn't. That's not a good impulse. But mediums were often accused of preying on vulnerable people. To prey on someone just means you watch them for an opportunity to attack. Of course, lions or tigers prey on other animals. They try to kill them for food. But vulnerable people would be older people or people who are grieving. It's easy to fool them at that moment in their lives. And they use their grief against them. They use their grief to trick them into giving up money for something. A lot of older people are often attacked or preyed on by these people and lose money in some of these awful schemes.
Especially those scammers, they make phone calls to older people and say, hey, we've got your son hostage here. You better pay 20 million NT dollars and we'll let him go. And of course, older people don't know about these scams, so they believe it. They are vulnerable. They are easily attacked, and sometimes they fall for those scammers. So again, they prey on those vulnerable people and they use their grief to make a profit, which is a pretty low class there. People are suffering from the loss of a loved one, and yet there are still people out there who want to make a buck from that by preying on vulnerable people. And even spiritualists themselves admitted to this, including the Fox sisters. Maybe eventually they have a conscience or something and they realize,
feel guilty.
Yeah, they feel guilty. Oh, we've been fooling these people for years. I really want to come clean. I want to have a fresh slate here to clean the slate or whatever it is and start anew. I'm going to confess that I've been doing this all my life. So yes, these scammers or these spiritualists finally admitted to it. Yes, it's all a ruse. It's all an act. We've been scamming people for years. And even the Fox sisters admitted that they made the whole thing up.
They said that they had faked all those things for so long. As the 20th century rolled on or continued on, spiritualism's status diminished. It wasn't viewed as being such a cool thing anymore, and it no longer enjoyed the popularity it once had. That's not to say the movement is extinct, though. If something's extinct, typically it no longer exists. We use this word to talk about certain species of animals, that they're no longer living on the earth. All of them have died off. So this movement is not extinct, though. It's still around. There are things called spiritualist churches, and groups still number in the hundreds and can be found around the world. I don't know of any personally, but I believe that our author did research on this. For example, in the UK or the United Kingdom, spiritualism is counted as the 8th largest religious group. Very interesting.
Quite big there, so I suppose they've got the Church of England there, the Catholic Church as the big ones, and then maybe Muslims or whatever. But this one comes in at number 8, so that's a pretty large number there, pretty high number. So there are still people who believe in this stuff. And we've got the United Kingdom as an example, but of course in the US and other countries, I'm sure this movement is very much alive. However, despite maintaining its main principle of communication with the afterlife, modern spiritualism has mostly done away with the illusions and showmanship of earlier practitioners. So this movement has changed over time. They still maintain or keep the main principle of communication with the afterlife. In other words, talking to the dead. They still say that they can do that, but they've kind of changed the way they do that. They've done away with the illusions and showmanship of earlier practitioners. So here, to do away with something means you no longer do that, you've gotten rid of it.
Right, to do away with. Illusions are when people try to get you to believe you're seeing something that's not really there. If you ever watched, who was that magician, David
Copperfield?
Yeah, David Copperfield would do these grand illusions during his magic show. That looked very real. Of course, he was tricking you, and the audience all understood that. We just couldn't figure out how he was doing it. That's an illusion. Or sometimes people have an illusion that they're going to be this famous rock star or famous actress, but they really don't have any talent. That's an illusion. It's never going to happen. Showmanship is a word we use when someone's really convincing on stage, especially. A lot of the circus performers have a lot of showmanship. And this word practitioner is just someone who practices in a particular field. It doesn't have to be magic or spiritualism. It could be someone who practices chiropractics or is really, into veganism or vegetarianism. They're a vegetarian practitioner.
I've heard of nurse practitioners as well.
True.
Who are basically nurses. And most mediums are now simply mental mediums who speak for the deceased without physical displays. So they've gotten rid of all the showmanship and the illusions and stuff like that. They basically just say that they talk to the dead there. And with many people still practicing modern spiritualism, it seems that there is still interest in searching for answers from the spirit world. That much is certain. And this is how they do it in the West there with mediums and things like that. But I'm sure here in Taiwan, this practice is probably alive, and maybe you guys can discuss this amongst yourselves about how the living communicate with the dead and stuff like that. I'd kind of like to know myself how that's done. Not that I want to communicate with anybody who's dead, but I'm just curious about the subject. So hopefully we've aroused your curiosity as well. So that brings us to the end of our explanation. Here comes our Chinese teacher.
好，我们继续来看，Houdini其实就花了很多的力气跟时间来揭发这种诈欺灵媒的事件。我们知道，在英文里面 ，blowing the whistle， 吹哨子。其实我们说一个吹哨者，也就是要提醒大家说有些错误或是危难，像这边 blowing the whistle， 意思就是它是用来揭发别人，它要让大家知道这些人根本就是在骗你的。我们再往下面一段呢，其实灵媒真的用他们的方式来剥削弱势团体。注意到了，这些灵媒被控剥削人 be accused of， 注意到咯，这个 accused of的 of 介系词，所以后面会加动名词，而这边有一个片语 preying on， 意思呢就是伤害，就是欺骗。他们呢根本就是对于这些弱势团体的人，把他们当作是诈骗的对象。我们前面提到 The Fox Sisters， 他们真的就是如此，他们自己都承认了。那我们再往下读，下面就说到了，当然灵媒这些事情所造成的这样子大家疯狂在想通灵这件事，这种运动并不是消失了。其实在今天世界各地还是有，以英国来说 Spiritualism 还被当作是第8大的宗教团体呢。谈到这里，我们注意一个动词 number。我们说到全世界其实还有好几百个这种通灵教堂跟团体。number 当动词来用，就是表示数字可达多少。那我们继续来往下面读，下面就说到了，其实在现代的招魂术里面，大概都不会去想要把它当作表演一样，跟早期的这种通灵的表演性质不同。现在的灵媒大概都是属于哪一种的呢？ Mental mediums 是属于那种心理的灵媒。这个心理的灵媒意思就是说，他们可以 speak for the deceased， 意思就是说帮那些已过世的人讲话，替他们传达他们的讯息。这个片语 the deceased， 想想看，我们标题里面说到 the dead， 其实这是一样的用法。我们把 the 再加上一个形容词，就表示所有具有这个特质的全部的复数的群体。像 the dead， the deceased 都是指过世的人，已亡者。好喽，我们今天的讲解就到这边，谢谢大家聆听，我们下次见。
That's it for our history unit here. It's been kind of fun to find out a little bit more about spiritualism in the past and some interesting people in the history of the world who practice this particular spiritualism. Whether it's still ongoing today, which we found out it is. We hope you learned some good words and phrases in particular. Thanks for joining us, guys. We hope you'll come back soon for English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Tom.
Bye-bye.
Bye.